Hard slab construction. So this is working with clay that is at the wet leather hard stage. So the first thing we need to do is make a slab. So I've got my clay here and I just need to start flattening it out. I like to flatten by hand first before I grab my rolling pin, the side of my hand, pressing it down, all of that. And as I'm doing it, I am stretching it in multiple directions. So I am rotating it, I'm moving my hand around, I'm flipping it over. I can also use my rolling pin to tap it. So it's better to stretch it a little at a time than in one big go. I want to go for even thickness. So now I'm going to start rolling it out. And again, I'm flipping it and moving it. I'm still, as I flip it, I'm being careful not to like stretch it in one way, one direction. I want to be careful that I don't go off the edge like I just showed you here, because what happens is it does get too thin. So I'm just rolling to the edge and not going off of it. So changing the direction of my rolling pin, of my clay. Now, then I'm going to grab my tool, my plastic tool, and kind of smooth it down. And I might notice an air bubble, which you saw I just popped here with my needle tool and then smoothed and compressed back down. This is just an old plastic like credit card or gift card. Now, how do I know when it's the right thickness? Because it does end up getting a little thin on the edge. The best thing to do is just cut a strip off. And so I can see here, it's pretty even, but it is a little bit thicker than I want. The exact thickness depends on what you're making. For a functional small item, something on the thinner side is better. I usually try to go around 1/4 inch, but for like a beginner project or something that needs to be carved or a little bit larger, pinky thickness or even pointer finger thickness is fine. So I've stretched this out a little more and I'm going to check, and I have something about pinky thickness here. So again, for maybe a more sculptural thing, this would be great. Now, it's really advisable, and if you're in my class, required, to make templates, at least for your first time building with hard slabs. Templates help you envision what your shape is going to look like in the end. It also helps to make sure that you're cutting out the right shapes and that you're going to have enough slabs to work with. So I'm just playing around with shape here, and so you could, already have an idea, or you can kind of try it out. You should ultimately tape these together, and I'm using regular paper, but a stiffer kind of cardstock would be great to help hold its shape. And taping it together helps you see the overall form of it and proportion, which is hard to see when it's just flat. Now, sometimes I will even make little registration marks so that I can tell where everything sits. And what I'm going to do now is I do have my slab laid out, but I am not cutting my template pieces out. I am going to cut my slab into smaller sections so that they're easier to store and dry. Right, especially if you're working in a small space. Now I want to leave enough space around each piece of my template. I'm not going to end up using the edges of my slab. So now this needs to dry. The key to working with hard slabs is that you're working with them at that wet leather hard stage. So I find the best way to do controlled drying is with some newspaper. So I have a sheet of newspaper and I folded it over. Of course, if your slabs are too big, you might just use a sheet that's not folded over. And I'm going to stack them. I want to make sure I don't have the edges of my piece draping over, because you can see it will then dry at an angle. So I might cut that part off. So I'm folding and stacking and folding and stacking. And I might put a few extra pieces of paper in here. And what happens here is that the newspaper is going to absorb the extra water content from my slabs. But I don't want to leave them just like this, because then they will still dry out too much. So put them in a plastic bag and then wrap them up and let them set for maybe a day or 3. Now, when they are dry enough, how do you know that they're at the right wet leather hard stage? Well, you're going to check them. So I have my slabs here, and what I'm going to do is pick one up, and first of all, I can see that it's holding its shape. It's not flopping, right? And I want to be able to bend it a little bit, right? So I can bend it, and now it will hold that bend. And I can also squish it, so you can see I can squish it a little bit, but it's starting to crack as I do that, and if I bend it more, it will break. So this is a wet leather hard stage, so I do want it at that stage. Now, the ones that I'm not using, I want to keep wrapped up because I want to maintain this dampness. I want to keep it in a stasis. So I'm wrapping it up and maybe double bagging it, right? So just keep this in mind. Don't just leave them out because they will get too dry. So I've kind of folded them over, and then I'm going to put them in another bag. So really making sure that there's no way that they can dry out. I'm pressing all the extra water out, and I'm using the weight of my slab to hold the plastic down. I don't want to crumple it up because then I'll make a bump in there. All right, so that is how I will keep those maintained while I'm not using them. So here's the one piece that I'm using. So the other 3 are wrapped up. I have my templates here, and I want to lay them out, making sure that I'm not right up to the edge, because again, that might be a little bit thinner, it might be a little bit drier. I'm using more of the middle parts, so I'm going to end up with a good amount of scraps. We'll talk about what to do with those at the end. If I know I just need a right angle, I can just cut this off right away. Now, if you have a ruler, great. If you don't, any straight edge will work. Now I do find that when I'm working with hard slab construction, my pieces do get a little bit smaller than the template I'm working on. So keep that in mind, and I would advise that you make your template a little bit bigger than you actually want your end result to be. And you'll see why that happens in just a minute. And you often will need to cut a few times if your clay is getting a little bit dry. So you might have to cut through 1 or 2 times to really go all the way through. If it takes a lot to cut through, then your clay has probably gotten too dry, in which case you need to rehydrate. Now, these are my pieces. I'm going to wrap those up when I'm not working on them. We need to do what's called beveling for attaching. This gives us more surface area. I don't want to do this, which gives me less surface area. The more surface area I have, the better and stronger my joint's going to be. So I have laid my ruler slightly on the inside of my edge, and I'm going to cut with my needle tool held at an angle. Now, if you have like a box cutter or an X-Acto knife, or what's called a Flattening knife for ceramics, those work great. But if you don't have them, a needle tool will certainly work here as well. It does take some practice. You basically want around a 90-degree angle. And of course, there's specialty tools for this, but when we're working from home, we're going to work with what we have. The key thing is that my ruler is a pretty heavy metal ruler. So if you have a very flimsy ruler, you're going to need to find something else to use instead. Even a book, right? A book at an angle or something could work here. So I'm going to cut both sides at an angle. Now I have to keep in mind where am I attaching them, because I'm going to bevel kind of the opposite way. So what's beveling in one angle and the other side, it's going to be like the opposite. I'm not sure how to explain that, but if you look here, you can see how they're going to match up, right? And you can see there's more surface area. Now, so critical anytime in ceramics, but even more so with hard slabs, is to score and slip in order to join them. If I don't do this, they will not attach. That is like 100% guaranteed. So scoring is when I'm scratching lines into my clay, and I'm scratching pretty deeply. And slip, you can of course just use already made slip, but I find that I just add a little bit of water to one side with my brush, and I'm going to score again. And you can see I'm scoring quite deeply here, and that's really important to get that water to mix in there and really make a slip. Sometimes I'll score the other side, especially when I'm working with hard slabs. And now I'm going to join them together, and I'm pressing them towards each other to get them to start to bond. So the scoring opens up the kind of particles of clay to join back together. I'm going to compress on the outside and press them together, again, really getting them to join. And now I need to reinforce that with a small coil that I've made. So I'm scoring on the inside where my joint is. I'm going to score that little coil as well, put it on in there, and then I'm going to press it in. I want to make sure when I press it in that I'm also holding the outside so I don't just like pop it open. And I might use a tool to smooth it together if I need to reach in there in a different way. I want to compress on the outside and clean it up. And that's essentially how I will join all of my different pieces. Now, if I get something that is too dry, my slab is dried out, I can rehydrate it with a piece of a sponge that is just slightly damp. It's not dripping. And so you can see I've just added some water there. And then I might actually just wrap it up in plastic and let it sit for a little bit and absorb that water, making sure my plastic is really nicely tight and wrapped up. Sometimes you'll find the edges lift up. That's potentially because it is drying too fast or unevenly. That's another reason we don't use all the way to the edges for hard slab construction. We kind of discard that. Ways to avoid this: I can weigh it down, I could flip it over, and it also is a sign that I probably need to rehydrate it. All right, when I am storing the slabs that I'm not using, we've talked about this a little bit already, but it bears repeating. So I'm putting my slab in plastic, but the key thing here is I'm pressing all the excess air out, and I'm kind of folding my plastic over so that there's no air in there no extra air to really dry it out. I find that it's really helpful to store my slabs on something flat so that as I move them, they do not get warped and moved by my hands. So I have a piece of drywall here. You could also use a wooden board, or as long as you're not getting it wet, a book works too. All right, you have all these scraps. Don't throw them away. They are still very usable. They just need a little bit of love. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab maybe a bowl, definitely a bag. I'm going to put them in my plastic bag. If you had a Tupperware, you could do that instead. I'm going to kind of break them up into smaller pieces. You can do this at any stage of wet or dry. I'm going to add some water. I can spray it down, or I could just take a sponge and squeeze some water into there. I don't want it to be a giant puddle, but I want to be able to see the water a little bit. And then I'm going to seal it up and just let it sit for maybe a couple hours. And that's it.